Okay. All right, so we are going to be looking at the firewall user management. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we're going to be looking at the firewall user management. Basically, we are looking at how can we manage the firewall users. What kind of mechanism do we have to manage the users who are going to be using the firewall? So upon completion of this course, you'll be able to understand the AAA technologies and also user authentication technologies and user authentication management configurations. And let us look at the authentication, user authentication, and the AAA technical principles. User authentication. The growing number of application layer attacks not only brings additional threats to our network security, but also places further strain on how we can access our network. So enterprises want the capability to precisely identify who is accessing that, and to ensure that there's legitimate application and they're operating normally, and also block the applications that may bring security risks. But like previously, using only IP addresses and ports, they are no longer sufficient to distinguish users and applications on our network. And the traditional access control policies based on quintuples cannot adapt to changes in the current environment. And that's why we want to look at this. Today, we have our enterprise internet access. We have different people trying to access, and they need to know who is this, because if there's data leaks, we're going to have significant economic losses. Irrelevant applications can consume network bandwidth. Like you're working, someone is busy downloading and torrents and watching YouTube, and it's consuming all the bandwidth, and yet people here who need to, process payments are unable to do so. That's leading to economic losses to the company, or even irrelevant activities that's decreasing working efficiency. Someone is on Twitter the entire day instead of focusing on their, or even games, instead of focusing on their work to do, or even someone is actually visiting some of the blacklisted sites, like let's say pornography sites and all that, like the illegitimate behavior, which damages group interests, and also pervasive, web threats over the internet. So how can we be able to make sure that we can either authenticate or even control this from happening? So what is AAA? AAA stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. We want to know, can we be able to make sure that whoever is accessing that is a real user? They know their details and they're authenticated to access that. Do they have the permissions to access whatever they are accessing? Do they have the right to get what they are accessing? And for how long should they access what they're accessing? And for how long have they been accessing whatever? When they're accessing whatever they're accessing, what did they do on the network? What did they delete? What did they add? What did they modify? So we need to be able to also account for that. So an example is that when we are accessing the internet, a user needs to enter his details, right? The username and then the password, and that is for authentication, to make sure that that is the authorized user who is actually authorized to go ahead and access that. And after authentication, then the firewall will start to authorize the user to access some of those things. They'll give them authority. You know what? You are granted permission to go and access the resources which you want to access, right? And after accessing those resources, still the firewall will go ahead and account for the operations and the duration when the user has been accessing those things. That is AAA, and that's what we want to look at. When it comes to authentication, how is it done and why is it done that way? Authentication basically refers to the confirmation of users' identities using various factors. You can use factors like what I know. Those are your passwords, your PIN codes. Those are things that you know in your mind, in your head. These are my security questions. That is what you know as an individual. You can also use what the user has, right? You can use to have a password authentication disk, or a USB certificate authentication. You can choose to have like cards, right? You can use to have like cards and all those things that you can have on you, right? To access and be able to get access authorization to the system. And also who you are or what I am, your voice can be used to authenticate you, your iris scanner, your fingerprint biometrics data, your face even itself can be used to authenticate you. So you can use some of those things to determine the identities of various determine the identity of various factors or various users. So that is authentication. When it comes to authorization, you authorizes accessible resources and authorizing available commands. You know that this user is allowed to access these kinds of resources. They can either access, let's say, our database or our file server and do a BCD. And what commands are they authorized to do? Can they delete? Can they add? Can they modify? Can they create? Can they, change this and that? So you're also looking at what they can do and also what they can access. And here we have different types of users. We have a guest, we have an employee. And this example, you're seeing the guest can access only the public resources, whereas the employee can go all the way to the common service system, and the manager has access even to the sensitive service systems. So this is authorization. When it comes to accounting, basically we have just looking at how long did the user use the service. Was it for 1 minute? Was it for 10 hours? Was it for 1 hour? And how much did the user spend? And what have the user done during that time? So basically, that is it. So the AAA technologies, we want to look at some of those technologies. We have two technologies, and we have three ways we can authenticate users. The first one, which is not listed here, is what you're calling the no authentication. Just like you hear the word no authentication, it means that it is performed for trusted users. But in most cases, this type of authentication, whether you trust someone 1,000 times, it is not recommended. Whether you trust them, make sure that they are authenticated to know what they're doing on the system. Even if it's a database administrator himself, you should be able to track out down the administrator's activities on your system. So the first one is no authentication, and there's no authentication at all, and it's usually done for trusted users. The other one is local authentication. And with local authentication, basically, it configures users' information, including the username and the password and the attributes of the local users on a network access server. Okay, the network access server. So all the devices are configured on or are stored on our local access server, and local authentication offers fast processing and low operation costs. But since if you have multiple users, or if you're going to store a large number of user information, then it is limited by hardware. You cannot have it being able to process all those authentication details at the same time. So local authentication, you have your local users, they are stored on your network access server, and they're stored locally on your machine. Whereas with server authentication, which is a third one, we're looking at it and we're saying here that it configures users' information and everything, including the username and password and attributes, on a third-party authentication server, and AAA can remotely authenticate users through remote authentication dial dials in user service, the Radius protocol, or the Huawei Terminal Access Controller Access Control System, the HWA TSCSCS protocol. So you can, here you have a third-party server which is storing your devices, and you're going to use AAA to get authentication from the server. So those are the three ways. So we want to look at the Radius, and we're saying that Radius is one of the most common protocols used in implementation of AAA. It is widely applied in our network area network access server systems, and it defines how user authentication and accounting information and results are transferred between our network access server and our radius server. So the NAS transfers user information, authentication and accounting information to the radius server, and then the radius server receives the connection requests from users, authenticates the users, and then returns the authenticated results to our server. Radius uses a datacom protocol, datagram protocol, the UDP at the transport layer to provide excellent real-time performance, and it also supports a retransmission mechanism and backup server mechanism to ensure high availability. The process of transmitting the messages between the server and the client is that when logging into a network device such as a firewall on an access server, the user sends the name and password to the network device. And after sending the name and password to the network device, the radius client or the NAS on this network device receives the user name and password and sends it to an authenticated request to the radius server. And if the request is valid, the server completes the authentication and sends the required authorization information to the client. And then if the request is invalid, then the server will send the failure information to the client. So basically here, user sends the username password through our network device, and this network device will send the request to the server. It processes and sees if it's invalid, check. If it's valid, go ahead and also respond and convey the information. If it's valid, send the connection details to the firewall so that the user is authenticated on the firewall.
I checked.
Yes, please.
Sorry, sir. I wanted to find out. If let's say that does it mean that a user cannot get authenticated on the server authentication without connection to the server?
I'm not getting your question.
If let's say a user wants to get authentication to a device
Yes,
on
yes,
the
yes.
authentication server,
Yes, yes, yes.
the server, yeah, does it mean if the server is offline, the user won't get authenticated?
If the authentication server is offline?
Yes.
Yes, definitely, because it is requiring them to first have a connection or authenticated status for them to access whatever you're going to access on the system. But that's why it's important for network engineers or people who are designing up a network to make sure that there's always redundancy, right?
Yes.
To make sure that you have a fallback plan. I think even someone has said it in the group. You can set up a fallback, or you can send up a standby, server to make sure that it takes care of redundancy. All the reliable systems you'll see in the world, they have backups that are actively running. You cannot have a single point for failure on your network topology.
Thank you very much.
All right. So we want to look at the radius application scenarios. Here, the process of exchanging the radius is as follows. So you have a user here who wants to establish a connection. He will go ahead and enter his password, his username and password. And after the username is sent, the firewall will go and request on their behalf. And after this guy will check through the details and see if they're correct. And if they're correct, it will send back access accept. And then after that, it will start accounting. It will send a accounting request to start saying for how long you're going to be online. And then this guy will accept for him to start accounting. And then the user now can access the resources. And then after, when the user is done, the accounting request to stop will be sent to the server, and then the server will respond, and then the user session will be terminated or will be brought to an end. So we want also to look at the Huawei terminal access, the Huawei terminal access controller access control systems. It has so many AAs and CCs. So Huawei TSCSCS overview, and it's basically an enhancement of the terminal access controller access control system, which is similar to Radius. And this protocol uses client-server model to implement communications between the NAS and the servers. So a typical application of the Huawei, this protocol is to perform authentication, authorization, and accounting for users logging into a device. And the device functions as the HWTSCSCS client to send the user information, name and password to the authentication server to the server for authentication. And if a user is authenticated and authorized, then the user can log into the device to perform the different operations. The application scenario for it works like this. The user sends the login details, and then this guy will send the authentication to start the server, and then this guy will respond to the message, please enter your username. And when this guy receives please enter your username, he enters the username and sends through the authentication device to the server, and the notification message continues to send the username to the server, and then the response comes back, says, okay, please now enter your password. When the user enters the password, it goes through the server, and the notification participant message triggers password to the server, and then authentication response, authentication passed, and then authentication authorization request is sent. So after this guy receives the authentication response and the authentication is passed, then it requests for the authorization request. And then authorization response is passed, then the user successfully logs in and they can access the resources from the server. Comparison between these two, the HWTSCS and Radius, is that when you're using HWTSCS, it uses TCP, whereas Radius mostly uses UDP. And when it comes to encryption, the Huawei's protocol, the device encrypts a packet except its own header, and here the device only encrypts only the password field. So someone can tap the packet and they get to know the user ID, let's say, and other information that are following on the packet. With this Huawei protocol, authentication and authorization are separate. It separates authentication and authorization, whereas this they are implemented and they go together. And application, it applies to security control, whereas Radius only focuses on accounting. With configuration and command authorization, supports authorization of configuration commands, whereas the Radius does not support authorization of configuration commands. Let us look at the lightweight directory access protocol, the LDAP overview. And the lightweight directory access protocol is developed from the X500 directory access protocol. The X500 organizes objects hierarchically into a tree structure. Like you have a tree kind of structure. You can even have other things connecting onto this. So basically organizing things in some kind of a tree structure. And the X500 directory service implements identity authentication and access control. The LDAP simplifies the directory and meets internet requirements. So using the basic concepts, basically the LDP information is organized in a tree structure. That's what you should know. And the basic data unit is an entry. Okay. The basic data unit is an entry, and each entry consists of multiple attributes. An attribute consists of a type and one or more values. So the directory information tree, the information tree is a collection of directory entries. And we said an entry is a node in a directory tree, information tree, and consists of series of attributes. Whereas an attribute describes the features of an objective, and it consists of an attribute type and one or more attribute values. Relative distinguished name, the RDN, it uniquely identifies child entries of an entry, the RDN, and the DN uniquely identifies an entry in a directory information tree. You look at that later on. I know I've been fast. So its authentication process is as follows. The user enters the username and password to initiate the login. And after, when this guy receives them, the administrator bind request goes to the LDPA server, and then it responds with a bind reply, and then it will send the DN search request, which we said this one directly represents an entry in the DIT, the directory information tree, and then the reply will come through. And then they will bind the user directory entry to the request, and then the bind will come back, and then the authorization will take place, and then finally the user will be logged in successfully. User authentication classification. These are basically how you can classify authentication, and there are several types of how you can classify them. And we're going to look at local authentication, server authentication, single sign-on, and SMS authentication. I know you have seen, maybe you didn't pay attention, but you have met almost at all of these things, and you have looked at them, and you have actually used them before. So let us look at local authentication. Local authentication, a user sends the username and password that identify the user to the firewall through the port authentication page. Like you're on the page and they're asking you, please log in to access this Wi-Fi, right? So, and the firewall stores the password and performs the authentication method, the authentication, and this method is what they call local authentication, right? And then with server authentication, we also looked at it, and we say that server authentication, basically a user sends the login details, credentials that identify the users to the firewall through the port authentication page. And the firewall does not store the password, but instead the firewall sends the user name and password to a third-party authentication server like the Radius server for it to perform the authentication. And this method is what we are calling server authentication method. And then we have the single sign-on. And with a single sign-on, like you hear the word single sign-on, the user sends a name and password that identify the user to a third-party authentication server. And after the user passes authentication, the third-party authentication server sends the user's identity to information to the firewall, and then the firewall only sends the user's identity information but does not perform authentication. This is called single sign-on, yes, on the server. Okay, so then SMS authentication. When it comes to SMS authentication, most of you have ever received when you're opening up a bank account or even when you're initiating your WhatsApp for the first time, and they send you a code which you get, and then you paste in that code on your WhatsApp, or that SMS code, verification code that you usually get for you to be authenticated in the system. So here a user accesses the portal for authentication and requests an SMS verification code. I know some of you have met this, and the authentication succeeds only after the user enters the correct verification code on the port authentication port. This process is called SMS verification code. So we want to look at user management and application. And then after we shall call it, we shall have one more slide and then we call it an evening. So user management, you can use AAA authentication and user authentication and then user management. Basically, just seeing how can we be able to authenticate the user so that they access whatever they want to access on our system. How can we even group them? Let's say there's a marketing department or sales department, etc, or this kind of traffic is allowed, this one is not allowed, blah 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 blah. So we want to look at that. So organizational structure of our users, a firewall provides user level behavior and access control on a network. So you can be able to have different levels for the user. And the user organization structure involves just basically three concepts. The first concept is the authentication domain. And with the authentication domain, it is the container of a user organizational structure similar to that domain of the Microsoft's Active Directory service. And the firewall provides a default authentication domain and supports additional users created authentication domain. With the user groups, you can also use user groups. We have seen the authentication domain, and now we want to look at user groups. Users and the departments to which they belong are basic units of an enterprise. So an administrator can choose to divide users into different groups depending on their departments to form a tree-shaped kind of organization structure for the intranet. And this is commonly used structure to facilitate the lookup and location of users and different user groups. Like you have your organization. From organization, you have, let's say, management, you have administration, and let's say you have maybe customer care. And management, you have maybe directors, you have CEO, right? And then under administration, you have maybe IT department, human resource department, you have other departments under that. You can also choose to have other groups under that. So you can choose to have different groups, and you have your kind of tree structure in your organization. And then the third concept is a security group. And a security group is a cross-department group in a horizontal organizational structure. And a security group enables you to manage users in a dimension other than by department. Yes, so you can choose to have a security group which is going to be cross-dimensional, and you can create a group between multiple. Can create a group between multiple groups. Okay, so organizational structure and management, we have talked about this, that the system has a default authentication domain, and each user can contain multiple, and each domain can, or each group can contain multiple users and user groups. So each user group belongs to only one parent user group, and each user belongs to at least one user group. Just like you see, you have your authentication domain, you have your marketing department, you have a visitor. And then, marketing department, you can also choose to have other subgroups. And even under the R&D department, you can choose to have two departments, department 1 and department 2, and then you can have them. But then you can also have cross-department groups at security groups, and you can have different user groups from different departments. And we have already looked at that. So classifications of users, we can have an administrator. These are the user classifications on our firewall. We can have an administrator. Like you hear the word administrator. An administrator is a user who accesses the device through Telenet, SH, web, FTP, or console port, and configures or operates the device. So anyone who has access to those devices is who we are referring to as an administrator. The internet access user is an intranet entity that accesses the internet resources. The internet access user is an internet access user is an intranet entity that accesses the internet resources. For example, you have an internet employee in your department or organization, and they have access to the internet. That person will qualify to be an internet user. So such a user can directly access the network resources through the firewall, which authenticates the user and performs access control according to the policy applied to the user. And the third kind of user is a remote access user. And the remote access user is an extranet entity. Extranet means is out of the organization that accesses your internal resources or your intranet resources. For example, you have an employee at the branch of an enterprise, or an employee on a business trip, and such a user must first access the firewall through a secure line, SSL, VPN, or IPsec, or LTTP VPN, or PPO. We shall look at VPN on chapter 4, module 4, or PPOE. So before accessing the network resources at the headquarters, so there must be some kind of virtual private network for them to enable them to access the intranet resources. So we have seen three. We have seen the administrator, internet user, and remote user. We want to look at administrator authentication processes and configuration. Administrator can log in either using console, telnet, SSH, FTP, or even the web. And for console, the administrator, the console port provides the command line mode for device management. I don't know if the network engineers, but if you're a network engineer, you must have used it. Most of the devices have a console port where you just connect your cable directly to your computer, and you're able to access your device through a command line prompt. A command line is basically like your CMD, right? That appears like this, and then you go ahead and type in the things that you want to change on your device. If a device fails to start normally, usually you can diagnose fault over or enter the boot ROM system through the console port to upgrade the system. So you can just connect directly to the console port of your firewall, connect it to your computer, and then you're able to change your configurations. With the web, we shall also see with the web, we already saw that to access our Huawei graphical user web interface, we use and access it from 192.168.0.1, and then we access it, and then we are able to change to change to change different things. So you can be able to also use the web. So the web UI, user interface, enables you to log into the device remotely through either HTTP or where is the web, or HTTP or HTTPS. There's also Telnet, and Telnet enables you to perform device management through command line. It's also usually basically remote. So you have your Telnet server, which enables you to access your different devices. Or you can use SSH, which has enhanced information security and provides powerful authentication functions. It is used to establish a connection, a secure channel over an insecure network. And in this case, the device serves as a SSH server. Device management using console to Telnet. We shall look at these things later on, how you can set those things manually, or you can get the slides and go through them because they're basically just steps on how you can be able to change the password and enable Telnet or FTP or console from your web graphical user interface. Okay. And then authentication process for internet users and remote users. Basically, they have to go through this entire process to be authenticated. They either have to access the Active Directory single sign-on a server, or the Agile controller, or even the Radius server for authentication.
Hello, sir. We can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You went off for a little bit.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I don't know what happened, but I just saw my screen stopping to share. I don't know what could have happened, but nevertheless, we shall move.
Maybe it's ransomware.
Ransomware. Everything is possible, and given the fact that we're not the ones in charge of Zoom and their servers, so it's very possible for people to hack Zoom. But also, those guys have put in place very secure mechanism, though they have been hacked over and over time. So we're looking at single sign-on, and it refers to the firewall obtaining user information from other authentication systems instead of authenticating users, so the users can go online from the firewall. We have already looked at these things basically, but if users need to directly access the network resources after being authenticated by the Active Directory server, you can configure the Active Directory single sign-on to trigger authentication. And Active Directory single sign-on can be implemented by following these different modes. Like you can install the single sign-on service program to receive messages from the PC. That is one mode. Install it to receive messages from the PC, or you can install the service program to query the Active Directory server for security logs, or you can use the firewall to monitor the Active Directory authentication packets. There are three. The first one, receive messages from the PC. The second one, query the Active Directory security logs. Or the third one, to the firewall to monitor the authentication packets of the Active Directory. So here, receiving messages from the PC, we said that with this kind of method, you need to deploy an Active Directory single sign-on service on the Active Directory monitor, and to configure login and logout scripts on the Active Directory server, and then set the SD single sign-on parameters on the firewall to receive the user login and logout information from the Active Directory single sign-on. So you have your computer here, and to be able to receive the Active Directory service, you need to make sure that you configure it. And then after, when the user tries to send and communicate to the internet, the Active Directory will first prompt the user to log in. And then after logging in, the user will send the the user information to the Active Directory monitor, and any computer in the Active Directory domain, including the Active Directory controller, can be able to send this information to verify from our Active Directory server, and then the user can send now the user information to the firewall, and then they are able to access the internet. So after the Active Directory single sign-on, we have looked at receiving the message from another PC. Here we also have querying security logs from the Active Directory server. With this method, you need to deploy a service, a single sign-on service on the Active Directory monitor. And this can be an Active Directory either controller or another device in the Active Directory domain, and set the Active Directory parameters on the firewall to receive user login and logout information from this service. So when the user will try to log in, and he will send his details through the Active Directory server or the controller, and then it will query the security logs from our single sign-on service, and then check the details. And if the user is authenticated, then it will send the user login information to the firewall, and then the firewall will permit the user to access the information or the internet. Then the third one, the firewall listening or monitoring the Active Directory authentication packets. In this mode, the program does not need to be installed on the Active Directory server. The firewall listens to the authentication packets sent by users who log into the Active Directory server. It is just monitoring, but to obtain so that it gets the authentication results. And if a user is authenticated, then the firewall will add the mapping between the user name and the user's IP address to the online lists. So this guy is going to the monitor here. It's going to just be there monitoring, right? Just be there. The user is going to try to log into the Active Directory server, and the firewall is just monitoring what is taking place. And if the user is authenticated, then it will also grant the user access to the internet. Okay, so the port authentication for internet access users. This is in port authentication, the firewall or the third-party server provides a port authentication page to authenticate users. You can trigger built-in port authentication using the following methods: either redirected authentication or user-initiated authentication. With redirected authentication, the redirected authentication implements authentication for internet access users when they attempt to access the HTTP services. So when you are trying to visit google.com and you're loading the page, you'll be redirected and tell you, boss, please log into this page, provide your username and details. And then after passing the authentication, then it can redirect you back to google.com. Or you can use user-initiated authentication. And with user-initiated authentication, it indicates that internet access users proactively access the web pages for identity authentication before accessing network resources. They need to first go to where they need to be authenticated, get their page, log in with their username and password, and then they can go ahead and get access to the internet. So with built-in authentication triggering mode, redirected authentication, when receiving the first HTTP service access data flow from a traffic user, the file will redirect the HTTP request to the authentication page to trigger identity authentication. And if authentication is successful, the user can access HTTP and other services like here. So the user will try to access Google or Huawei.com or Zoom.com, and instead of the user directly accessing the page, the user will first then be redirected to an authentication page where they'll provide their username and password. And if they are granted, then the server will give them access to the HTTP servers after being authenticated, and then they can access the internet. With user-initiated authentication, an internet access user initiates the authentication request on the authentication web page hosted on the firewall. After receiving the authentication request, the firewall implements the identity authentication for the user. So before even the user accesses like google.com or Zoom, he will first go to the authentication page, put in his details, and then the server or the firewall will give him access to go ahead and access the internet. With remote access user authentication, remote means the user authentication refers to the authentication of various VPN access users. They're accessing the systems remotely. They're not necessarily connected to the same network, but they're accessing them remotely. And the authentication triggering mode is determined by the access mode. Either they're going to be using SSL VPN, L2TP VPN, IPsec VPN, and PPOE method. So we are going to be looking at these things in module 4. Do not worry, we shall be looking at VPNs later on. And here is an example of how they can use SSL VPN users accessing internet resources. So they'll first log in into the device and submit the account and password. And after doing that, the user authentication succeeds. The firewall will go ahead and that to access the resources, and then or maybe allow account B to access the resources. So account A will go ahead and send in the request, and then after the firewall verifies, it will go ahead and say user authentication is authenticated, and then the user is allowed to access the resources. And then okay. Basically, we are looking at authentication policy. Like you hear policies, they're the rules that you determine. You can set them up individually or by yourself. Authentication policies determine which data flows need to undergo portal authentication and authentication exemption. When you're coming up with your policies, basically you're looking at which data needs to either go authentication or which data do we need to exempt. The firewall does not authenticate passing by data flows by default. Usually by default, the passing by data flows is denied. And authentication policies are required to filter data flows that require authentication. An authentication policy takes effect on the following authentication modes: either single sign-on, redirected authentication, user-initiated, or authentication exemption. So authentication policy, they are explaining more of the policy. It is a set of authentication rules that determine whether to authenticate data flow. An authentication rule consists of conditions and an action. And the condition used by a firewall to match packets are as follows. You first look at the source or destination or the region where it is going. After that, looking at the source, determine the action. An action indicates how a firewall processes the packets. Possible actions as follows. Either take them to the port authentication or exempt them, or no authentication, or go ahead and perform SMS authentication. Configuration process for the internet access user. Like we already went through this process, but basically you have your single sign-on server or the third-party server. You configure the server, configure the authentication domain, configure the user groups, and then also configure the authentication options. Yes. And then after doing that, you have your configure the authentication policy. You can either choose to manually configure or import some of these user groups from the server. You can configure them. Even the configuration options, you can either set the parameters or you can set the global parameters, and then either choose authentication exemption or portal authentication. This is how you can configure a server radius on your portal, on your web UI. I will advise you to get the slide, and when you install your firewall, you're able to go through some of these things. But you can just select choose object and then choose authentication server radius and then click add to create a radius server. If you want to add configuring an Active Directory server, still select Object Authentication Server, and then click ID, and then click Add, and then create the Active Directory server. When you're creating users and objects, basically, this is the process you go through. I will not go through this. They're a bit straightforward. Just get the slides and try to look through them. Okay. This takes us to the quiz. And question 1, Which of the following items is not covered in AAA? Which of the-
Management.
Management.
D. Management.
Management.
D.
All right, thank you.
Management.
Okay, I see you're attentive. Let us look at question 2 now. Which of the following modes are available for the Active Directory single sign-on? We have A, receiving messages from the user PC. We have B, querying security logs from the Active Directory server. We have C, with the firewall listening to the Active Directory authentication packets. And we have D, direct PC login.
C.
This is a multi-choice
A,
question.
B, and C.
C is the correct answer.
This is a
ABC.
multi-choice question.
ABC.
It's ABC.
A, B, C. Perfect.
And C,
Remember, we
yes.
said these are the three
ABC.
ways. Remember, the first option we said receiving messages from the user PC, querying security logs from the Active Directory server, and with our firewall listening to the Active Directory authentication logs or even packets. Those are the three modes we talked about. And we have looked at the user authentication overview and the AAA technologies and user authentication management and applications. So thank you. That brings us to the end of that chapter. And I'll stop the recording from here.